Well, hi everyone. Thank you for joining me now. My name is Sandra Mowry, and I'm going to be talking about Dubrovnik, because tomorrow we will be visiting that lovely walled city. And first, what I'm going to do is give you a brief history of Dubrovnik, and then I'm going to be showing you things that you will see tomorrow and giving you their significance. So, the Croats like to say that they are a nation of 101 Dalmatians, first referring to the fact that the Dalmatian coast has hundreds of islands. In fact, 1,185 to be exact. But secondly, referring to the familiar white dogs with the black spotted coats. And these Dalmatians, in fact, the embassy in Washington actually had one as a live-in mascot. And the Croats love to keep them as family pets, but they've been considered the work dogs of Europe. Now, the name Dubrovnik actually comes from an old Slavic word, Dubrava, meaning from the woods or forest. And it originated with a Slavic village tribe called the Dubrans, from that same root word, who lived in the forested hills that are just north of Dubrovnik today. Now, also, the ancient name for Dubrovnik before that time was Ragusa. And Ragusa is the name that Italians still refer to Dubrovnik as today. So even modern Italians never call it Dubrovnik, they call it Ragusa. The city was actually founded when they joined two settlements, the one I mentioned on the forested hill with one on a rocky area just south of the present-day city, which was a shelter and a haven for refugees, Latin and Greek refugees that came there. So it did become a Roman province as well, and the effects of the Romans were far-reaching. They started the industries of mining and metallurgy, and the emperor Diocletian was actually born in Dalmatia, as were 4 other Roman emperors born in Dalmatia, and Diocletian ruled the area for 20 years. Now, Dubrovnik's prosperity has always been based on maritime trade. It was the only city-state from the Middle Ages on to rival Venice. So it was sought after by Venice and Austria and Turkey and many other countries because of its very strategic position as a port. But it was not until after the Crusades in 1205 that it became a sovereignty of Venice up until the mid-1300s. But Dubrovnik's prosperity really peaked in the 15th and 16th century when merchants from Dubrovnik traveled all over the world, founding settlements from India to the Americas. And they would bring back with them culture and agriculture from these foreign lands to enrich Dubrovnik. Now, one of the keys of their success was that they didn't take these lands and seize them up, but rather they opened them up for trade. And they traded under ships that had a white flag with a single word, libertas, meaning freedom. And that was a flag that was adopted when they abolished slavery, long before any other countries even considered abolishing slavery. Now, by the turn of the 16th century, Dubrovnik had 50 foreign consulates in 50 different lands, and they had 200 ships plying the Mediterranean and beyond, and the coastline for Dubrovnik itself extended 75 miles. Dubrovnik has always been very forward-thinking and very socially conscious. They started the first medical service for their people in 1301. Now, the first surgeons were barbers, because who knew better about cutting than barbers? And if you had a problem and you needed a specialist, you were sent to the blacksmiths. They also had, the government put in a no cure, no pay kind of law to discourage quackery from doctors or physicians writing out prescriptions for things that really didn't work. So you didn't have to pay if you weren't cured. Now, the first pharmacy was started in 1317 and is still in use today. So that makes it the oldest existing pharmacy in Europe. Now, it is right off the main street, and Dubrovnik is very compact, so if you want to take a look, you can go in there if you need some pharmaceuticals, or even if you don't, and just take a look at the apothecary bottles that are lining all the shelves, and it's just off the main street there. The first nursing home, or home for the elderly, was started in 1347, and the first quarantine hospital, the lazaret, was 1377. Then they founded the first orphanage in 1432, and they abolished slavery in 1410. So very forward-thinking. They started a water system that was based on a river that was 7 miles away, and this ancient system, this hydro system, would be the salvation for the city of Dubrovnik, which I'll explain in just a moment. But Dubrovnik's politics were quite unusual. The chief in charge was the rector, and he had to be over 50 years old, and he could only serve 1 month at a time, and he served along with the Grand Council, which were the nobles of Dubrovnik. You'll be able to visit the rector's palace if you choose to do so, but I bet a lot of you seasoned travelers have been to many palaces throughout Europe, and you, I think, might be a little disappointed in how plain the rector's palace was inside. It's not lavish and beautifully decorated. It's well worth a visit because it has a maritime museum and all. But again, because they were so forward-thinking and they were so into being fair to all of the people, they didn't feel that it was fair to lavish a lot of very expensive things on their officials and have them living much better than their citizens were living. Now, they also had a Senate, which was 45 wise men who all had to be over the age of 40. So you can see they believed that with age comes wisdom. And the Archbishop of Dubrovnik had to be a foreigner. And that was to discourage any connection between church and state. So they wanted that separation between religion and politics. Now, a catastrophic earthquake hit Dubrovnik in 1667, actually, and over 5,000 people were killed, and it leveled the city, so that all of those magnificent palaces that had been built by the merchant princes who had so much money from their trade were ruined. Now, they rebuilt the city, but they decided, because with the earthquake came lots of fires and everything burned, and so everything had been built in wood because they had all these forests right around them, so they decided they had to rebuild in stone. And so stone was at a premium, and they needed lots of it, so they made a law that anyone who entered Dubrovnik had to bring in a stone with him or her so that they could rebuild the city. And when they rebuilt, it was even more elaborate. They used the Baroque style, which was so popular then. So today in Dubrovnik, the streets, the buildings, the ramparts all look much as they did in the Middle Ages. Now, this would be your first view by land of the walled city. If you come by land, I think we'll be anchored, but sometimes that can change even at the last minute. And if we're docked, you would ride in and you would get this lovely view of Dubrovnik. This is a view of the city at twilight from across the harbor, and you can see that everything gets illuminated once the sun starts to go down, and it's just a magnificently beautiful city. Now, because it was, everything had to be built within the walls, there were some constraints for space. So you will see, as you're walking around, that the buildings and the homes are very close together. I don't know if you can see that right on the right edge of this is another building. So privacy became an issue. And they would be window to window, and they really wanted their privacy, but they didn't want to seal off their windows so that they got no air circulation. So they came up with the first privacy shades. Now, these privacy shades, you'll see these little protrusions with little holes in them. So what they did was they hung a fabric outside the window there so that the air could still circulate, but that they would have privacy from their neighbors. Also, after those devastating fires from the earthquake, they decided that all kitchens had to be on the second floor. So in Dubrovnik, the kitchens are upstairs, and that's in case of fire, but also it's so that the odor and the smoke will rise up and not bother the family. The old city is entirely surrounded by these ramparts, and they are 1.3 miles around the ramparts. And one of the most popular things to do in Dubrovnik is to walk the walls. So you see some people here who are actually walking on those walls. Now there are 2 different access points where there are stairs going up, and they actually charge a little something, a few euros, to walk up there for the privilege of walking on the wall. But it's well worth it. The views over the top of the city are beautiful, and then you have the views out to sea as well. But be aware, there is very little shade up there. And we are so fortunate to be traveling at the time of year when it isn't sweltering hot, so that probably won't bother you. But I've been here in the summer, and it can be very brutally hot up there on those walls. The walls are actually double. And the interior walls, of course, were the first built. They were built at the time when invaders would attack by climbing up the walls and coming into the city. But then later, with the advent of gunpowder and cannons, they added the exterior walls to repel the cannon shot. These are cannons, defensive cannons mounted on the wall that you will see as you're walking around the wall. Now, as devastating as that earthquake was in 1667, it only proved to weaken Dubrovnik, but its real demise actually came with the surrender to the French forces in 1805. Napoleon told the people of Dubrovnik that they only wanted free passage, that they weren't going to occupy the city. But just a few months later, they barricaded the harbor and they entered the city and took it over. So on that day, the people of Dubrovnik painted all of their crests and their flags black, painted the walls black in mourning for that happening. 1991-92, Dubrovnik was shelled by the Yugoslav army and Serb and Montenegrin irregulars who hid out in those rugged hills that are just north of the city. The hills still have landmines in them. So I remember the first time I ever visited and I saw this gondola and I thought, well, what a beautiful spot. We'll have to go up there and get a view out over the city. But I realized it wasn't running, and the reason it wasn't running is because of that war and because of the fact that there are landmines all over up there, so it's very unsafe to be up on those hills. But during the siege, the local population took shelter in their basements to wait it out, and they survived on slowly dwindling supplies of food and fuel and medicine. Now, the attackers were not trying to target the monuments because they really wanted to take over the city. But in any case, the people did not surrender the city and turn it over to them. They held out. And the reason that they were able to hold out is because of that ancient hydro system that I mentioned to you that was built in 1436, and it brought water from a river 7 miles away. There were actually 2 fountains constructed in 1438 that were places where some of the water supply would come in. And these fountains are called the Onofrio fountains, and they're at either ends of the main street there. This is the little Onofrio fountain, which is at the entrance of the city that would be on the water side where the port is, the harbor is. And then this is the large Onofrio fountain, which is on the west end, and that's on the land side. And so these fountains were constructed so that visitors would wash away the possibility of carrying the plague into the city. Now, it's very doubtful that these waters washed all the germs away, but they did provide, from these 2 fountains, potable water for these people who were hiding out in their basements at a time when there was no electricity to pump water, so there was no other way to get any water. They had no phones, no electricity, nothing, but they were able to stay alive for the 3 months that they were there because of these fountains. Now, this large Onofrio fountain, if you are going to be walking around with a party of more than just yourself and you want to split up, this makes the greatest meeting spot in the city because there's usually some shade, and then as you can see, you can actually sit all around on the fountain itself and do some people watching. So it's a good place to rest and kind of watch people while you're waiting for members of your group to come back. And also, should you get lost, everybody knows where the Onofrio fountains are. So you can just say you want the big Onofrio or the little Onofrio, and they will direct you to them. Now, I mentioned that they were at either ends of the stratum. So the stratum is a main street. It's a pedestrian street. And where I'm standing, whoops, had to have a color change since last year. I was getting a little gray. Had to go light. But anyway, where I'm standing, don't worry, everybody does it sooner or later, right? But anyway, if you watch the Today Show and that segment, Where in the World is Matt Lauer? He was standing right there when he was broadcasting from Dubrovnik, right where I'm standing. And it's quite a happening little street. We were there in July, and they had a fashion shoot with fashion models wearing beautiful clothes, parading up and down while the photographers were snapping away. So it's kind of a fun place to be. Now, the entire siege lasted for 10 months, and it really turned a vacation destination into a ghost town because the tourists stayed away in droves, and it really decimated the economy. But thanks to a lot of media coverage, money poured in from all over the world to help with the rebuilding and cleanup of this mess, this war. As you can see, there's damage here. 80% of the roofs of Dubrovnik were damaged. And what they actually did to try to repair these roofs was, thanks to all this money that came in and these very skilled artisans that came to give their time to rebuilding Dubrovnik, they would go to the ruins of Rome and some of the other ruins in Italy, and they would look for the old tiles to match the old tiles that had been on those roofs to try to keep everything just perfect. But they didn't always get enough of them. So I took this close-up, or my husband took this close-up, to show that the bright orange tiles obviously are the new tiles, so we really didn't get enough. And also we took that because of that little calico kitty. We had one at the time who's since passed, but we were very nostalgic for our little kitty, and so we took that picture. But if you'll notice that when you see these roof tiles, they're tapered. And I don't know if you would all know the reason for that, but the reason is for the way that they're made. The man who is making the roof tiles puts the clay over his thigh. Now the thigh tapers to the knee, and then uses a piece of string or piece of vine to cut the tiles to size. So the size and shape of a roof tile depends on the man's anatomy that is making that roof tile. So you can look out, as I'm doing, over the city, and you can see where there's damage and where they've been repaired and all of that kind of thing. But early on in my cruising lecturing career, many years ago, we were heading for Dubrovnik, which has always been my husband's Bali High. Now, I call Bali High one of those places that calls to you that you've always wanted to go to. And so we were both very excited to be heading there when I fell off a castle wall in Spain and I fractured my leg very severely. I displaced the bone, so it couldn't just be set and we couldn't just go on. I had to be flown back and have surgery and screws and wires and pins and hold it together, and it's perfectly fine now. But right after that, the bombing took place, and we thought we are never going to see that Dubrovnik that we fell in love with through pictures and through television images. But, of course, that wasn't true because it is just the way today that it looked so many years ago. So that was on our first visit back. We were kind of just having fun on the walls. That's up walking on the walls. And this is just this past July, where I'm sitting on one of the many narrow staired streets. And this would be on the north side of that main stratum. You'll see lots of little narrow staired streets that go up, and there's a lovely little lane that parallels the stratum up there, and it's lined with outdoor cafes, and they all have awnings. So if you want to get out of the sun, if you want a place to sit down and relax, it's a great place to go to have a cappuccino or a cool drink or seafood. They have lots of seafood restaurants all along that side. On the opposite side of the stratum are like a maze of little streets that are all lined with shops, and some of them look just like this. This is the way that all shops were required to look back in the Middle Ages. And that is so, with this half window, half door, that no one shop could get an advantage by looking fancier and lure people in. They had that sense of fairness where they wanted everything to be on an even playing field. So all of the shops looked exactly like this. Now there was another practical reason for this half door, half window, and it was because the shopkeeper would stand in that door and make sure that people wouldn't come in and help themselves, because he saw everything getting by and everything going back out. So he kept shoplifting at a minimum that way. Dubrovnik's patron saint and protector is Saint Blaise, an Armenian physician who was martyred for his faith. Now, because he happened to save a child who was choking on a fish bone, he became known as the Saint of Throats. But to the people of Dubrovnik, he was much more than that. He became their hero because he actually saved their city. And the way he did that was, in a dream, a local priest had an image or vision of Saint Blaise, who came to him and detailed a very elaborate plot by the Venetians to take over the city. Well, these Venetian boats came in, and they said they were really just coming to get fresh water. But because they had been forewarned by St. Blaise, they knew that they were really doing surveillance for this attack, and so they were able to be proactive and thwart the attack. So ever since that time, the people of Dubrovnik have adored St. Blaise. And this is a statue of the saint. The miracle of St. Blaise was that when the Romans asked him to denounce his faith, and he refused to denounce his faith, they flayed him alive. And after they peeled his skin off, they threw him into the ocean, and according to the legend, he arose from the ocean unharmed. Now you will see his statue all over the city. This is the pile gate, or the entrance from the land side, and the statue that you can make out there is St. Blaise. And with the pile gate, there is a stone bridge with two Gothic arches, and it connects to a little wooden drawbridge. And for centuries, that wooden drawbridge was drawn up every single night to protect their city. This is the church to St. Blaise, and this is in the most popular square in Dubrovnik, right near the harbor, so you won't be able to miss it. But for years, this is actually not the original church for St. Blaise. That was a Romanesque church, and then the earthquake of 1667 destroyed it, so they rebuilt this church to St. Blaise in the Baroque style. But the years, even since then, hadn't been kind to that church. It was shelled during the war, and they repaired it, but then they were having a public service, and a section of the roof fell down, and they declared the church unsafe. So for many, many years, when we've been going back to Dubrovnik, this church has been closed to the public and has been totally covered with scaffolding. And we were just here in July and got these pictures because it was just opened back up. And this statue of St. Blaise on the top is magnificent. That was added since we were here before. Now, they make a really big deal of St. Blaise's feast day. They have celebrations and lots of food, and they have a parade where they take reliquaries through the streets containing body parts of St. Blaise. His head, a bit of bone from his throat, and both of his hands are in these reliquaries. And people line up to have their throats blessed by local priests on his feast day. Another church that you can visit is St. Ignatius, and that is the largest church of worship in Dubrovnik. And it was St. Ignatius was the saint who founded the Jesuit Society. And this has a beautiful, magnificent pink marble altar and very elaborate. And you can also visit a Franciscan monastery that is in the city and was destroyed by the earthquake or damaged, and they have rebuilt it, and that is the cloister there. Now, just in the bay, you'll see a little tiny island called Lokrum. And Lokrum is also known as the Island of the Kings, and that's because Richard the Lionhearted was shipwrecked and cast ashore there, coming home from the Crusades. And he was so grateful to be alive that he wanted to found a church right on Little Lokrum. But the people of Dubrovnik convinced him to please put the church in the city, not way out on this little uninhabited island, and he did. Here's a close-up of Lokrum. For a time, it was owned by Maximilian of the Habsburgs, and he built a home there that looked like a tower, but he put in magnificent gardens, and he had plants from all over the world put in there. And that was a very common thing to do at the time. Kings and royalty and nobles would build beautiful gardens, but they wouldn't use the local flora. They would import plants from all over for these gardens. And that's how Lokrum actually got its name. Lokrum means sour fruit. So it probably came from a citrus tree or something of that nature that was planted in that garden. Now, Lokrum is totally uninhabited except for families of peacocks, which you'll see strutting all over Lokrum. And it has a tiny little lake called Dead Lake. Dead Lake is actually connected to the sea, and it's a great lake for non-swimmers and for children because anybody can float. It's very salty, very tiny, not very deep. And there's also a fort. This was done when the French came, and this fort is actually in the shape of a star, but you can't really tell that very well from that. And it was Napoleon's fort, 1805. But you get some beautiful views back of Dubrovnik from up on that fort. And the local people like to come over there on their boats if they have a day off or a holiday and spend the day there picnicking, and there actually is a nude beach, if you're so inclined, over there as well. It only takes about 10 minutes to get from Dubrovnik over to this little island. But maybe this little visit will whet your appetite to come back to Croatia. Its coastline is spectacular. It's a wonderful place to cruise or sail because you have lots of tranquil bays and craggy cliffs and little inlets and beaches area and forested areas and hundreds of islands to explore. So it really is a magnificent coast. But inland, they have some spectacular national parks like this one. This is the park of 16 lakes. So you have 16 emerald-colored lakes that are all on different levels, and then they're cascading in just wonderful waterfalls all throughout. Now, I'm going to close today by telling you about another little walled city that's north of Dubrovnik called Zadar. Has anyone visited Zadar? Ah, cool. Well, I know you have, Phil. My husband raises his hand, but somebody else did too. But I wanted to just mention it because of a very unique feature. It has a sea organ. Now, has anyone ever experienced a sea organ? Ah, good. This is an organ that has 35 polyethylene pipes of varying lengths and tilts and diameters, And the organist is actually the sea or the waves, which kind of gives new meaning to new wave music. But it plays as the tides change and as boats go by. You hear the air force through these pipes and the water, of course, and you hear a continuous concert of sound. And it's extremely soothing. And it's put underneath this 230-foot quay or seaside promenade that's in Zadar. And at this one end of it, where we happen to be docked that particular day, is a sea organ. And you can see where the sound comes out, the holes that are all along there. And the morning had been very chilly and kind of rainy, and I've got layers and layers of clothes on. And then we went in and we had lunch, and the sun came out. So we came back, and my husband and I were sitting there listening to this very soothing music. And with our tummies full in the sun, he fell asleep, and he pitched forward, and he would have fallen right in had I not grabbed a hold of him. But the music that you hear is likened to a whale song, and to the humpback whale in particular. I do quite a bit of lecturing up in Alaska, and so I talk about the whales a lot. I love the whales. And the humpback has the most complex of all the whale songs. And what I think is so incredible is that the pod is all singing the same song, and when they leave to migrate to warmer waters, the point at which they leave the Alaskan waters, they have dropped in hydrophones to record these songs that they're singing, and they have found that they stop on a certain note. Then they go to the Hawaiian waters where it's warm, and then when they come back, they pick up their song on the exact same note. So this has happened year after year, which I think is absolutely incredible. But I think that you'll be seeing, at least I certainly hope, more of these sea organs in cities or towns that are on the water, that have the opportunity to put them in, because people tend to really enjoy them so much. And I just want to give you a little trivia here. Do you know that Croatians invented the necktie in the 17th century, and it was a symbol of fidelity. So they wore this around their neck as fidelity. And they also had another invention. Does anybody know? The ink pen was invented by the Croatians. So I hope that you will be as enchanted by Croatia and Dubrovnik as we have been, and that you have a wonderful time. And I also hope that you will come back to hear my talk on Rome, which will be, when will my talk on Rome be? The morning that we go to Corfu. I will be in here, same place, talking about Rome, wonderful port. So thank you so much for your kind attention today. Thank you.